Hi, and welcome to the video tutorial for the Down the Rabbit Hole shawl. All information, stitch count, and written pattern is available on my website, link in description box below. There's also links to my Etsy and Ravelry shops where you can support and show your appreciation for my work by purchasing the pattern for a small sum. The PDF also includes charts. If you think I'm going too fast, you can always pause or slow down the playing speed with the YouTube cogwheel. Enjoy this pattern and happy crocheting.
Row 144, chain 3, starting on the opposite of the increase, putting 1 DC in every DC here in the first cluster. And then we're going to continue with making 2 DCs in the chain space. And this is going to be 8 DCs in total, counting the first 3 chains as DC. The clusters are usually just 7, but since we're having 2, we don't have enough space here to start a new hole, so we have to cover it with DCs here. So 8 DCs, like that, and chain 3, and skip chain and the 2 first DCs. We get 3 chains, skipping 3, and putting 1 DC in the third DC from the chain space. So this is just basically a repeat of the row before the last, and it's going to be like this, but the start on the increase side and finish are going to be different with every row. So this is your repeat. Continue like this, putting 2 DCs in the chain space, chain 3, skip chain and 2 DCs, and go on. When you've worked the last chain space, we're chaining 3, skipping chain and 2 DCs, working 1 DC, and the next DC, and 2 DCs in the third chain from the previous row here for the increase. Row 145, chain 3, DC and first stitch for increase, and a DC in the next stitch. So we get 3 DCs, chain 3, skip 2 DCs and a chain, make 2 DCs in the chain space, and 1 DC in the following 5 DCs. So you get 2 DCs unworked on this cluster of 7, and from here chain 3, skip 3 stitches, 2 DCs in chain space, and the following 5. When we've worked the last chain space before the end, we're going to continue with putting 1 DC in every DC until we have 7, including the 2 in the chain space, which means we have 3 stitches unworked. And here we're going to start the new hole. So we're chaining 1 and putting 2 DCs in the last 2 stitches here. So we're chaining 1 and skipping 1 DC, like so. Row 146, chain 3, DC and DC. So you always have 2 at the beginning and the end here on the straight side, and we're chaining 3 to get that chain space, and we've chained 3 and we're skipping 3, 1 chain and 2 DCs, putting a DC in the third DC here in the cluster, and continuing 1 DC in every stitch here, and also 2 DCs in the chain space. So we have 7 in total. And from here it's the same repeat. Chain 3, skip, and 7 in a row. We've worked the last chain space. We're chaining 3, skipping chain and 2 DCs, which means we're on the increase. So 2 DCs in the third chain from the previous row. The increase side of row 147. Chain 3, a DC in the first stitch here for the increase, and we're chaining 2 because this chain space, these holes, they're gonna tone out into nothing and disappear. So just 2 chains, and we're putting 2 DCs in the chain space below here. And continuing straight forward to putting a DC in the DC and 1 DC in every following DC until only 2 remains of this cluster, just like before. And we get this a bit more tiny chain space here. And you continue with the same repeat all the way until the last chain space has been worked. Last chain space has been worked, and we're putting a DC in the DC and a DC in the third chain from the previous row. So we're left with 4 DCs as a cluster at the end here. Row 148, chain 3, DC and DC, and all the DCs here at the end of the previous row. And from here, the chain spaces are growing this way, which means we need 2 DCs in the chain space and chain 3, and we're skipping in till the third DC, and from here it's just the same repeat. And continue this until you've worked the last large chain space. Last large chain space has been worked, and we are continuing by chaining 3 and skipping into the third DC, sorry. And continuing 1 in every DC here, and we are also making 2 in the small chain space here. So we get a complete cluster of 7 here before the end of the row, and we're chaining 1 and skipping the DC here, putting 2 DCs in the third chain from the previous row. So we're going from 3 chains, 2 chains, 1 chain, and the next row is not going to have a chain here. Row 149, starting on the increase side with 3 chains. And a DC here, and a DC in the next DC. And coming up on the chain here, we're putting a DC in the chain space, and a DC in each and every one of these DCs until we have 2 DCs of this cluster unworked. So this part is going to have a few more DCs in a row than normal, but that's to get it right with the increases. And from here, same repeat, chain 3 and 2 DCs in the chain space, and 1 DC in every DC here until 2 remain unworked. Last chain space has been worked, and we are continuing the row with a DC in each and every DC, including the third chain from the previous row here. row 150, chain 3, DC in the next stitch, and from here we're starting a new chain space here. So chain 1, skip 1, and a DC in the 5 following DCs, and 2 in the chain space, so you get that cluster of 7 as usual. And chain 3 here, and skip all the way until the 3rd DC there, and continuing making these repeats. Last chain space has been worked, and we're continuing the last part of this row with a DC in every DC until you get to the 3rd chain from the previous row. And since it's the increased side, guess what we're gonna do? We're gonna put 2 DCs, yes, you knew it, in the 3rd chain from the previous row here. Row 151, chain 3, increase with 1 DC in the same stitch, and continue here until you have 2 DCs unworked before the chain space below. That's the last one, and chain 3, and 2 DCs in the chain space, so we get the movement of the clusters this way, and a DC in the following 5 DCs, and just the same repeat as before. The last chain space has been worked of the regular sized ones, and we have 2 remaining DCs and the small chain space here. So in order to get the increases right here of the holes, we're chaining 3, and we are putting a DC in the 2nd to last DC, and a DC in the 3rd chain from the previous row here, which counts as a DC. And from here we are getting the same type of increases with the holes up here. Row 152, start by chaining 3 and a DC in the next DC, and 2 DCs in the chain space, and chain 3, and here DC in the 3rd DC, and you continue with the same repeats as down below, like before. Last chain space has been worked, and we're finishing the row with a DC in every DC, and on the increase side here we're putting 2 DCs in the 3rd chain from the previous row. Row 153, chain 3, DC and DC here, and a DC in every DC here until we have 2 DCs unworked before chain space. Chain 3, chain 3, 1, 2, 3, and 2 DCs in the chain space, and continue in the next 5 DCs here, and same repeat as before. We have a few more rows of this pattern here. Coming up on the end, we're working the last chain space with 2 DCs, and continuing in the DCs that are left here at the end of the row. And don't forget that last one, the third chain from the previous row. So 4 plus the 2 here. Row 154, chain 3, a DC in every DC, and we're going to continue out in the chain space here to get the flow of the chain spaces right. So 2 DCs in the chain space, chain 3, skip these, and a DC in the third DC here of the next cluster, and continue the repeat until you've worked the last chain space. Last chain space has been worked, and we're chaining 3 and continuing here with the last DCs of the row, finishing off with 2 DCs in the third chain from the previous row. Chain 3, DC in the same stitch, and a DC in the following DC, and from here chain 3, 2 DCs in the chain space, and continue with a DC in the following 5 DCs. Last chain space has been worked, and we're continuing making a DC in each and every one of the following 5 DCs, so that we get 7 in a cluster here. That means we're leaving 3 stitches unworked, and from here we're chaining 1 and we're skipping a DC and putting a DC in the last 2 stitches here. Row 156, chain 3, DC and DC here, and from here we're going to continue with the making of a new chain space. So chain 3, and in the third DC here we're putting our start of the DC cluster. So 1, 2, and continue with the same repeat as we have before, doing 5 DCs here and then putting 2 DCs in the chain space, and then chain 3 and skipping until you get here, and continue this throughout the row until you've made DCs in the last chain space. The last chain space has been worked, and we're chaining 3 and skipping all of these and putting 2 DCs in the third chain from the previous row for the increase. 157, chain 3, DC in the first stitch, chain 2 here, and put 2 DCs in the chain space. And we're decreasing the size of the chain space on this side. And from here, we're going to continue with the same repeat as always, with the cluster of 2 DCs in the chain space and 5 here, 7 in total. And chain 3. working the last chain space here with 2 DCs and DC in each of the 2 remaining stitches here. Row 158, chain 3, DC here, and in the next 2 DCs also, and 2 DCs in the chain space, and continuing with 3 chains and a DC in the 3rd DC here, and the same repeat as before, and continue until last chain space has been worked. Last chain space has been worked, which is this tinier one, and we're chaining 2 and skipping the DC and putting 2 DCs in the 3rd chain from the previous row. Row 159, chain 3, DC in the 1st stitch, chain 2, and put 2 DCs in the chain space, and continue on with this cluster by putting a DC in every DC of the following 5, leaving 2 unworked. Just like before. And chain 3, and so on. So 2 and 2 in the chain space. And we've worked the last chain space, continuing with 1 DC in each and every one of the remaining stitches on the row. Row 160, chain 3, DC in the next stitch, then chain 1, skip 1, and a DC in every one of the 5 DCs coming after here, and continuing on with 2 DCs in the chain space. Then chain 3 and skip, and continuing making the same repeat, starting a new chain space here. Coming up on the last chain space, which is the smaller one, like so. Here we're gonna put 2 DCs in the chain space, and we're gonna chain 1 and skip 1 and finish the row with 2 DCs in the 3rd chain from the previous row. Row 161, chain 3, DC in the 1st stitch, DC in the 2nd stitch, DC in the chain space, and continue making DCs in all of these DCs until 2 DCs remain unworked. Here, chain 3 and 2 DCs in the chain space, and continue. We've worked the last big chain space, and these 2 and these are 7 together, which means we have 2 remaining unworked, and we're chaining 3 just like we normally would, and skip these 3 stitches, which puts a DC in the 2nd to last stitch and a DC in this, and from here color change to color B. Row 162, chain 3, put a DC in the next stitch, and in the chain space we're putting 3 DCs, 1 for every chain, and we're continuing this row with 1 DC in each stitch. And in the chain space you go around the chain space like this. So 1 DC in each and every stitch all the way. And you finish with 2 DCs in the third row from the previous row for the increase here, and change to color A. Row 163, and we have changed to A color. Chain 3, put a DC in the first stitch, and a DC in each and every stitch until end of row. And finishing with a DC in the third chain from the previous row, and we're continuing with the same color. Row 164, chain 3, put a DC in each and every DC throughout the whole row. Finishing off on the increase side with 2 DCs in the third chain from the previous row. Row 165, second to last of all rows. Chain 3, put a DC in the first stitch, and continue with a DC in every stitch throughout the whole row. Finishing the row, and here we're going to do a color change to color B, which is this one. Row 166, which is the last row of the main pattern part. So this is 3 chains, and we're continuing with the same principle, which is 1 DC in every stitch throughout the row. Finishing the last row before we start the edge, we're going to finish with the increase in the third chain from the previous row here, and we're going to change color for the edge row.
Wait, we're not done yet. The Down the Rabbit Hole video tutorial series continues in the next video for another section of fun crocheting. Hop on over there!